This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 45.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everybody, welcome to the I'm Getting Over a Cold edition of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. You know, I thought about delaying this recording until my voice was in, I guess it's regular, somewhat less gravelly form, but it's been a while since I put out a show, and I figured the show must go on. And I've got a great interview to share with you today, so I'm pretty psyched about that. So if you can just kind of bear with me here for a few minutes, I'll make this intro really short and get right to the conversation that I have in store for you. And to get to that conversation, I want to talk about our guest today. You know, I was listening to another show, and the host was saying something to the effect of, if you ever want to meet your heroes, start a podcast. And I'm reflecting on almost 2 years of podcasting now, and it's certainly been true in my experience. And today is no different. So today we have a conversation with none other than Dr. Wayne Fisher, who is the H.B. Monroe Professor of Behavioral Research at the Monroe-Meyer Institute and the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. He's also the director of the Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders at the Monroe-Meyer Institute. He has published over 175 peer-reviewed research studies in over 30 different behavioral or medical journals, a lot of those having to do with the assessment and treatment of severe behavior disorders, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about his career as well as his take on best practices as it relates to functional analysis methodology and function-based treatment. So I think it's an episode that you're really going to like. Before we get to that conversation, I do want to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Chartlytics. You know, Chartlytics is a single comprehensive system for behavioral reduction and academic improvement that's done through precision teaching. It's based on 50 years of peer-reviewed research and experience in applied academic and behavioral settings. So they do a lot of different things. One of the things Chartlytics has been about is they're doing a lot of cool workshops. And if you've been listening for the last couple episodes, you know that I recently attended one that was put on by Dr. Rick Cabina. And they've got a couple workshops that are coming up in the Pittsburgh, Connecticut, and Pensacola, Florida areas. And so if you want to attend any of these workshops, and if you want to save a few bucks, go to chartlytics.com/Matt and enter the promo code Matt, oddly enough, to save 10%. And on that same page, they've got a lot of other freebies, namely a free ebook on precision teaching and also a free 1-credit CEU webinar on, guess what, precision teaching. So it's a lot of cool stuff. It's a great workshop. I enjoyed it a lot, and I think you will too. So this podcast is also sponsored by Operant Coffee. And Operant Coffee, their mission is to help you serve amazing coffee while promoting environmentally safe and sustainable business practices. And I have sampled the coffee as part of the vetting process for this product, and I can assure you that it is outstanding. And I can be kind of picky about those things too. So, anywho, they are roasted with fair trade certified coffee beans and made in partnership with the Philly Fair Trade Roasters. It's made from blends of beans from Central and South America and the Pacific Islands. So if you want to save the world with sustainable business practices, go to operantcoffee.com. And if you want to save a few bucks while ordering your Operant Coffee, you can enter the promo code Behavior Podcast, and you'll be good to go. So that's it for introductory comments. Thank you for bearing with me. And don't worry, the interview was recorded well before this cold struck. And so without any further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Wayne Fisher. Dr. Wayne Fisher, thank you so much for joining me today on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you, Matt?
I'm really excited. It's
been something that I've been, as you know, we've been trying to put on the calendar for a little while, and I'm really excited that we carved out the time to do it, and it's been a one of those things I've been wanting to do since, well, for a long time, but especially since seeing the symposium at the last Chicago ABAI, when both you and Greg Hanley were kind of going back and forth with some philosophical differences about functional assessment and things like that. We'll probably get into that a little bit later on our conversation, but ever since then I was like, oh, I got to have Dr. Fisher on the program, and this would be fun to kind of kick around here, because that was an exciting exchange of views. So,
Okay.
But before we get to that stuff, you've been in the field for quite some time, and I would love to get your perspective about both how you got into the field, but also what the field was like as you were coming up as an undergraduate and graduate student and things like that, and how you first got exposure to behavior analysis. So if you could start with kind of taking us back to that time and letting us know what it was like at that point in the development of the field, that would be great.
Okay. Well, how I got into the field was really, I had a professor at the community college I went to for 2 years who taught psychology from a behavior analytic point of view, and described other schools of psychology as basically from a historical perspective. And the way he talked and what he talked about really clicked and made sense with me. But actually at the time I was interested in going into music therapy, believe it or not. And I didn't know much of anything about music therapy and hadn't seen any information on its effectiveness, but I was interested in music. I was interested in therapy. It seemed like a natural match. Then when I ended up going to Michigan State, and my primary instrument was guitar and secondary was piano, but they wouldn't let you major in guitar, and so I had to take the audition to get into the program on the piano after playing the piano for about less than a year, and I failed the audition and ended up going to the academic counselor who couldn't figure out what to do with all my music classes, etc., and said, well, you could always go into psychology and just count them all as electives. And that's basically how I got into psychology. And then I just was naturally drawn to the folks at Michigan State who were interested in behavior analysis. And I started volunteering, working with a young adult with autism, and then in a school, the Beekman Center in Lansing, for children with developmental disabilities. And I worked specifically in classrooms for individuals with autism, and was immediately drawn to the young child who had real severe behavior and had bitten the end of a finger off of another child in the class. And they asked me who I wanted to work with, and I said, oh, I want to work with that child. Crazy as that may sound, I was just very, very drawn to understanding and working with severe problem behavior.
So I always love how different people enter the field in different ways. So your lack of proficiency with the piano led to this several decades of scientific papers and things like that, numerous publications, yes, and so on and so forth. It's amazing. It's one of my favorite questions I ask guests on the podcast. So it's always surprises me how people contact the field in various ways, and so.
Yeah, I was very glad in the long run that I failed the audition.
Yeah, it's funny when people, that kind of cliche. It's like, well, things happen for a reason. Sometimes I'm more and sometimes I'm less convinced of the veracity of that, but this is certainly one of those cases where it seemed to pan out all right. So, yeah. So one of the things I want to talk about, obviously, is functional analysis procedures, and So I want to get your perspective, having been at this for quite a long time, is what's your take on how functional analytic procedures have evolved from, say, like the early days of, the original Awada et al. 82. I know we could probably like spend a semester discussing this, but in broad strokes, how do you see functional analysis as it stands now, as we're talking in 2018, as it was in comparison to when those procedures were developed in the 80s and 90s?
Yeah, I would say perhaps the largest change is less in the area of functional analysis and more in the area of what functional analysis has brought about in how we change what we do in terms of treatment and also in terms of analyzing behavior. And so functional analysis has provided us with an amazing tool that has taught us to think about problem behavior from a much more sophisticated perspective. And that has led to a variety of interventions that just weren't available before functional analysis procedures were developed. So for example, when I was at the Kennedy Krieger Institute, I was talking with a group of our psychology interns then, and they asked me, well, do we really need to do a functional analysis? If we feel like we have a good handle on the behavior, can't we just go ahead and start treatment? And so as I often did, I answered the question with a question. I asked, let's just say that we have a child who consistently engages in problem behavior when we introduce demands and consistently stops engaging in problem behavior when we remove non-preferred demands. How would you proceed with that child? What would you do? And they went through about 5 or 6 treatments for escape maintain behavior, such as escape extinction, demand fading, differential positive reinforcement, differential negative reinforcement, competition between positive and negative reinforcement. And I said, those are all excellent treatments, and none of them were available before functional analysis was developed, and functional analysis led to the discovery, use, and evaluation of those procedures. And so to me, that's one of the greatest contributions of functional analysis, is that it's led to us having a much broader array of potential treatments. Now, if I focus specifically on what's happened in functional analysis procedures, there have been quite a number of procedural refinements, how we set up functional analysis conditions, things like having equal reinforcement intervals across conditions, other things like interpretive methods. How do we interpret functional analyses so that we are reliable and valid in our interpretation? And we've done some of that research, my colleagues and I, and our latest iteration has recently been accepted at Bcba and should be coming out in early view and not too long, which we call ongoing visual inspection. And what this is designed to do is to help, especially novice behavior analysts, to look at a functional analysis, say after 3 conditions or 3 series of each condition have been conducted, and then to be able to test, does this look clinically significant? And if so, can we rule out that this pattern of responses occurred by chance? And we use very basic probability statistics, Bayesian statistics, to do that. And then if we identify one or more functions, then we also have a criterion that looks at, well, if we ran one more series, each condition one more time, is it possible that we could identify a second function of problem behavior? And if we could do that, we would go ahead. The recommendation would be to go ahead and run that next condition. If we don't, if what that tells us is even if we ran one more series, we wouldn't identify another function, that would tell us the functional analysis is complete. And so as we've tested this procedure out on, we did it on 100 functional analyses, what we found is that we could shorten the length of functional analyses by about 40%. And these are functional analyses published in the literature, simply by having a systematic way of interpreting the functional analysis and determining when we should stop the functional analysis. So that would be an example of a procedural refinement. And there's a wide variety of other things that have been done to help improve the efficiency of functional analysis procedures, such as conducting a series of alone conditions at the start to provide a screen for automatically reinforced behaviors. Trial-based functional analyses are becoming more commonplace, and we've recently reviewed the literature on efficiency, and that appears to be the most efficient way of identifying a function of problem behavior. And there are a variety of others. I won't go through a laundry list, but there's a large increase of procedural refinements, efficiency refinements, and also things that we can do to identify idiosyncratic functions. So if we run a standard functional analysis using the basic procedures developed by Iwata with some of the procedural refinements I've talked about, and our initial results are not interpretable, what do we do next? And we've developed a series of procedures to help guide clinicians in those next steps to try and identify idiosyncratic functions.
So that kind of brings up a favorite study of mine, or one of my favorite studies that you were, I believe, the primary author on, and it was just a brief report in Java from way back in 1996. It's on the reinforcing effects of the content of verbal attention, and so it looks like you guys, if memory serves, that you tested different types of attention-based responses, if I'm again recalling correctly, the individual was sensitive to certain types of statements that were like, don't do that, or that hurts, or something, or you're going to hurt yourself, whereas other types of attention were not, did not serve as reinforcers and things like that. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of, this kind of problem solving in the wake of an inconclusive FA?
Yeah. So, and ours, that was one of now quite a number of studies that have followed up on that paper on are there various ways of delivering attention that affect the effectiveness of that consequence as a reinforcer. And so we have kids that respond very much to very minor physical attention, being physically guided. We currently have a child in the house who where praise is the termination of praise is an effective negative reinforcer. So we're analyze this where if we provide praise contingent on compliance, we get very low levels of compliance. If when we deliver the request, write the letter B, and before the child does anything, we start praising them. Oh, you're working really hard. You're really doing a great job today. That would not result in, would actually result in very quick compliance if we then terminate the praise as soon as they comply with the task. So we've analyzed this several ways, and so one hypothesis would be that by delivering praise right from the start, it's acting as an abolishing operation and lowering the aversiveness of demands. And so the individual with all that praise is being more cooperative. and that proved not to be the case. That is, when we provided praise, but we didn't stop once the person had completed the task. We had very low levels of compliance and also had evoked very serious and dangerous problem behavior. But if we terminated praise as soon as they complied, then we had high levels of compliance and no problem behavior. So it was actually the termination of praise that functioned as negative reinforcement for problem behavior in this individual. And so we see individuals who don't present with the typical types of reinforcement contingencies of, normal attention, escape, tangible items. And then we've developed ways of looking at the behavior, of doing more focused interviews. We typically will go through, and once we've observed the behavior, we're then in a better position. We've had some experience. We could then talk more with the family about the specific situations in which problem behavior is evoked. We typically will do ABC data and do more focused observations. So if the behavior is primarily occurring at lunchtime, we'll observe then and collect ABC data. And then we try to generate hypotheses on what might be the idiosyncratic variables maintaining the behavior. And we'll do probe sessions, much like a trial-based FA, where we will essentially set up the establishing operation and see if the behavior occurs, deliver the reinforcer. And if we can do that several times, we're pretty confident that we've identified a potential function, and then we'll do a little bit longer and more detailed functional analysis on that idiosyncratic function.
So,
go ahead.
If I'm getting you, then for those individuals with inconclusive standard FA results, that you would do some form of descriptive and indirect assessment, not necessarily to replace the FA, but more so to set up a more refined probe analysis. In other words, it informs another FA that is now more, I guess, focused or circumscribed. Is that correct?
Yes. So our experience and belief is that descriptive assessments, we do very informal ones on the front end to help determine what forms of attention parents typically provide. And that helps inform our attention condition, what types of non-preferred tasks may evoke problem behavior. If the child may have a tangible function, what sort of items are most likely to evoke problem behavior when they're removed from the child. And so we can do that in a very brief interview with the parents. And that helps to inform our FA, but it doesn't really change dramatically what we do. We still do a fairly standard functional assessment. And our logic for that is that when you do descriptive studies, such as that done by Thompson and Iwata, Rachel Thompson and Brian Iwata, you find that the typical contingencies of providing attention, escape, etc., are almost ubiquitous. They occur so commonly that it makes sense to test those really common contingencies and either rule them in and rule them out as a function of problem behavior. But if they don't maintain problem behavior, we don't get a clear result, then we want to do a much more detailed descriptive assessment. And that's where we'll do an ABC data. We will do more focused and more lengthy interviews with the staff and parents, and then do these probe sessions to try and test out what we think might be the idiosyncratic function.
I see. From your view of the literature and the kind of lengthy scholarship that you've done in this area, one thing I'm curious about is, are there any kind of myths that you'd like to dispel or common misunderstandings about the functional analysis that you'd like to address? We have a lot of students of applied behavior analysis or practitioners who are very early in their careers and things like that. So what's your take on that? Are there any, because I'll give you kind of like a quick example of, and I don't know the extent to which this is true or not, but I went to a functional analysis workshop a long time ago, and the question came up about multiply controlled problem behaviors, and it was a workshop put on by Brian Awada, so obviously it was right from the source, and I don't know if I might not get exactly his wording just right, but I think the idea of like multiply controlled problem behaviors was kind of downplayed. And it was more of the follow up to that was that you had to look at the situation more closely and perhaps get tighter experimental control over your analysis. And so again, this was many years ago, and perhaps the literature's evolved since then. But again, that's just an example. So are there any kind of things like that you want to address, or at least help us understand a little bit better?
Sure. From my standpoint, perhaps the biggest myth is that functional analysis procedures can't be done by routine practitioners under normal types of conditions, or can't be done in school systems by school psychologists and perhaps BCBAs working in school systems. The procedures have become better defined, and we've developed things like trial-based FAs that often can be done very briefly and integrated with naturally occurring activities. And so we have a study in Java, Tiffany Kodak was the first author, and in which these were kids in our early intervention program who had behavior problems, not sufficient for them to go into our severe behavior program, but still it was important to understand the function of behavior to come up with an effective treatment. And we basically did trial-based FAs where they would run a program, say receptive ID program with the child, and at the end of that, or on the break, we might run 2 or 3 trials for the trial-based FA. And so over the course of a week, sometimes 2 weeks, we complete the trial-based FA, and it takes almost no extra time. That is, it's basically occurring during the transition between completing a program and taking a brief break, and we just fit it in there, sometimes taking a minute and a half to run several trials.
I see. So you alluded to this earlier in our conversation, and I want to circle back to it. So I want to ask a similar question as I asked about functional analyses in terms of their evolution over the years, and you alluded to different types of function-based treatments. So what from your perspective, how have function-based treatments evolved, and what, perhaps more importantly, are some kind of best practices as it relates to people out there practicing right now?
Okay. Sorry. For us, we've been working for a long time on improving functional communication training as a treatment for severe problem behavior. And we've done a number of things in terms of how do you select the functional communication response. Should you use functional communication training as the treatment versus would it be more advisable to start with non-contingent reinforcement, for example? And so we've developed a series of guidelines on those. We have videos and a treatment manual that we put together in coordination with Western Michigan University that's available on their website, that individuals can go and watch the video and then look at the manual. But just to give you some basic kind of framework, typically what we will do for kids, very frequently kids start out in what we call our family behavior management clinic, and we might start with a questionnaire such as the QABF, and if we get clear results, then we'll proceed to treatment. If we don't, we might move on to a trial-based FA, and if we don't get clear results then we're probably going to need to do a functional analysis, a multi-element and standard functional analysis. And then our first kind of big question is this behavior maintained by social reinforcement versus is it maintained by automatic reinforcement? And if it's maintained by social reinforcement, then we're going to generally start with functional communication training. And again, in this, in our videos and our training manual, we provide fairly detailed procedures on how to proceed with that, including the prompting strategies and with videos showing that. Once we have the child displaying the functional communication response consistently and we have low levels of problem behavior, we typically want to then move on to making the treatment more practical. We do that by doing reinforcer schedule thinning using a multiple schedule, where we train the child to emit the functional communication response in the presence of, say, a colored card, a blue card that our therapists wear on a lanyard. And we teach them not to display the functional communication response when we show the yellow card on the lanyard. And we go back and forth and do our training until the child is consistently requesting reinforcement when we signal that it's available, and consistently not requesting reinforcement that when we signal that reinforcement is unavailable. And once we do that, the fading and thinning of the schedule goes much more smoothly when we use a multiple schedule. And typically we will start with very quick changes between the SD and S delta, and then gradually extend the duration of the X delta to when for a typical child, we want them waiting, say, out of a 10-minute interval, they're waiting 8 minutes, and they're receiving reinforcement maybe for 2 minutes out of that 10-minute interval. For older children, we're going to use what's going on at school, what the expectations are in the classroom for determining how long the child needs to tolerate periods where reinforcement is unavailable. And also we may introduce work activities during the S delta period where reinforcement for the functional communication response is unavailable. We then test out the treatments and use the multiple schedule to help program for transfer across situations, across settings, and also across individuals. And our research has shown that, for example, most clinicians have had the experience where a particular child works really well with their primary therapist, and then that primary therapist goes on vacation or is ill for a few days, and somebody else starts working with the child and their behavior falls apart quite rapidly. And so we've found now that by bringing the behavior under good discriminative control of a multiple schedule, we can often prevent that relapse of behavior that occurs when we change the context simply by changing who the therapist is. We've shown the same thing where we can make transfers to new situations across rooms, settings, classrooms more quickly if the behavior is under the control of a multiple schedule. And we're currently working on, have a paper that we've just submitted showing that the multiple schedule can also facilitate transfer the treatment effects to the caregivers.
So
I need to hold on just a second.
Sure.
Sorry, my throat was getting a little dry there.
That's okay.
Okay. So
yeah, I've got the easy job, Dr. Fisher. I just get to ask a quick question, and you've got to do all this lengthy explanation. So
I was just going, so if the behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement would be our other major branch in our decision tree. Then we will typically do what's called a competing items assessment, where we expose the child to various preferred items, and we measure how much problem behavior occurs when they have that item versus how much they engage with the items. And then we're looking for items with high levels of item engagement and low levels of problem behavior. And then we program those in to help decrease problem behavior. If the behavior persists even with competing items, we will frequently add response blocking, and we found that approach works with the vast majority of kids with automatically reinforced behavior.
I see. Do you want to take a minute and kind of describe your program out there at the University of Nebraska?
Sure. So we have the Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders. We have roughly 120 individuals working in the center, faculty. We have postdocs, pre-docs. We have a PhD program, have about 15 PhD students in that program. We have a master's program affiliated with the University of Nebraska Omaha. The individuals are enrolled in the University of Nebraska Omaha, and many of them will do their practical work with us. We have a interdisciplinary diagnostic clinic where kids come in for workups. We see about 6 to 10 kids per week in that. And so we have a lot of kids coming in who need treatment, need services. We have our severe behavior program with kids with self-injury, aggression, property destruction, pica, elopement, behaviors that are harmful to the individual, to themselves, to others, or to the environment. And those kids come into the program usually for 8 to 12 weeks, and we do functional analyses. We develop the types of treatments that I've been talking about for socially mediated and automatically reinforced problem behavior. We then train the parents, we train the school personnel. Typically the last week of treatment is done in the natural environment, so our therapists are going out with the child and their family to situations in which the child's behavior has really been challenging, going to a restaurant, going to a mall, to the grocery store. And we want to make sure that the treatment's going to work under those naturalistic conditions. And then we follow them on an outpatient basis for about 2 years post-discharge. We have an early intervention program that has about between 35 and 40 children that come in between 6 hours a week and 25 hours per week. And in all of our programs, we integrate research with our clinical work. We have a virtual care program where we set up early intervention programs for kids that don't live close enough to come into the center, or where it's really inconvenient for the family to do so. And we can train registered behavioral technicians, we can train the parents in ABA procedures, and we can monitor and supervise the program via telehealth and web-based technologies, such that we can set up a program for a child without the child, the family, or the technician ever coming into our building. We've set up programs for kids as far away as Eastern Italy, the Pescara area. We currently have 2 families over there and a third, I believe, that's just starting.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a really unique program. Kevin Luzinski heads that program up for us.
We'll have to dig into that a little deeper, perhaps in a separate episode, because anytime I talk about training on the podcast, I get lots and lots of questions. We did an episode about parent training and an episode about telehealth, both of which were really popular. So this kind of is certainly melding both of those domains, if you will. So that's really fascinating stuff, and especially I would imagine in the Midwest, where I'm sure it gets pretty rural pretty quickly. Having that option is helping provide services to folks who wouldn't be able to get it otherwise. So sounds like pretty cool stuff you've got going on there. So what I want to do is transition a little bit into some questions submitted by listeners, and then we can kind of go back to some of the more function-based stuff. But and some of these will have some of these questions are related to functional analyses as well. So our first listener question is from Brian. He wants to know, what are Dr. Fisher's thoughts on the use of precision teaching and standard acceleration charting when working to decrease maladaptive behavior and increase functional alternatives? And just to give you some context, Dr. Fisher, we've done a couple of episodes on PT, and so I think it's certainly piqued the interest of a lot of folks in the audience. And if I'm not mistaken, Brian is a PT teacher. And again, the questions about using PT and also using the standard acceleration chart in terms of aiding the interpretation of FA results. And I know that's a topic that you had touched on earlier in the conversation.
Yeah, I don't have any strong. Actually, this is one where I don't have any strong opinions either way. If someone is well schooled in acceleration charts and finds them useful, then by all means, that's what they should use. From my standpoint, I've never really, I've been introduced to them. I've never really used them. And so it's hard for me to comment. I've found just the regular charting by session or by trial or a cumulative record works very well for my type of work. And I've not seen anything to say, well, if you switch over to acceleration chart that you get better or quicker interpretation. But I'm always open to, if someone does that research, I would be interested in seeing it and would certainly give it consideration, but it's not something I've had much experience with, so I could neither promote or criticize acceleration charts.
Okay. Bradshaw asks, would love to know the research on functional analysis and behavior support plans for average IQ and above average IQ individuals. And just kind of reading into her question a little bit more, she works with typically developing adolescent males who are, have what we might consider, emotional behavioral challenges or, emotional behavioral disorders, I guess, to use the kind of collective term. What's your understanding of the use of functional analyses in those populations?
So typically, you can certainly functional communication training has been done in those populations, and the use of multiple schedules. It actually goes much easier in terms of teaching children who of normal intelligence that you can have the reinforcer, you can request the reinforcement at certain times, but not at others. That can go very quickly, and the kids catch on to that fairly quickly. We have kids that come into our severe behavior program who are typically developing. We have a child right now that is about 8 years old, normal IQ, suspected bipolar disorder, who we've gone through a functional analysis. We're going through his treatment now. He's thrown us some curveballs just from the standpoint that he's sometimes smarter than we are, and figures things out very quickly and then twists them, and we have to make certain adjustments for that. But we, it's a minority of the kids that we treat are typically developing, but we don't alter our procedures dramatically for that population. And we've done things with kids who were suspected of having auditory and visual hallucinations, where we analyzed those behaviors through functional analysis and basically showed that they were under, at least in some cases, are under the control of environmental stimuli. And if we found otherwise that they persisted in the absence of social contingencies, that would make a stronger case that perhaps they were true auditory or visual hallucinations. But the functional analysis methods are very robust and can be used with a variety of populations.
All right. The next question or set of questions is from Celia, and she starts by saying, I just want to say that the fall 2016 issue of Bcba is one of my favorite all-time issues, with both articles. Let's see, and she references two articles, one by you and your colleagues, and then one by Jessel et al. Talking about the ISCA. Kind of both of those articles were kind of back to back in the episode, and she says behavior analysis has never been so exciting. And just to give some context to the listeners who didn't see those articles, particularly your article, I believe you guys did your own kind of assessment of the ISCA protocol. Given the procedural and perhaps philosophical differences between the ISCA and the standard or traditional FA, what are your comments in regard to the ISCA approach? What are your thoughts as they relate to the functional communication, tolerance, and compliance component of the ISCA treatment? So this, I guess, we're kind of getting towards the elephant in the room, I suppose. So,
okay.
And she's got a couple other questions,
okay.
But I guess we'll start with general discussion of differences between the two.
Sure. Let me start with the last thing first, and say that the version of FCT that Greg Hanley has come up with is very appropriate, and he gets, I think, very good treatment effects. And I have no issues whatsoever with synthesizing contingencies for appropriate behavior. Where my disagreement comes is in synthesizing contingencies during the FA without first testing for those contingencies in isolation. And so a traditional functional assessment, as designed by Iwata, assumes that individual contingencies produce primarily independent effects on problem behavior. That's what Brian Iwata was saying at the conference, at the talk you heard, is that attention functions as reinforcement or it doesn't, escape functions as reinforcement or it doesn't, and probably in very few cases do we see where a child will display problem behavior when that behavior results in both attention and escape, but not when it results in attention alone or escape alone. And so that's the hypothesis, that the contingencies operate primarily independently. Now, the synthesized FA or ISCA assumes simultaneous or interactive control of behavior by multiple contingencies. That is, this idea that the behavior is differentially affected by the combination of attention and escape, or tangible and escape, or all three, attention, tangible, and escape. That's the assumption underlying it. And one of my biggest problems with that is that the synthesized FA never tests that assumption. That is, a synthesized FA simply proceeds as if the assumption were true, right? Never tests for interaction effects. So how would one test for I shouldn't say never, almost never would be more accurate. So how would one test for interaction effects? Well, the very basic procedure of testing for an interaction effect is you test for the effect of each variable in isolations. So for example, you test for attention and you test for escape, and then you combine them. And you would conclude that there is an interaction effect if and only if you get differential responding in that combined or synthesized contingency treatment, but not in either of the individual contingency conditions. So you would get behavior when you synthesize it, you wouldn't get it when you deliver attention alone, and you wouldn't get problem behavior, or you'd get much less problem behavior when you deliver escape alone. There is literally only one, maybe two cases in the literature where you can actually make a reasonable case that there was an interaction effect. And so that raises the question, what does a synthesized analysis analyze? What's actually being analyzed? And if the research question is what individual contingencies reinforce problem behavior, then a synthesized analysis really offers no analysis. It doesn't answer that question. And if the question is the research, what a combination of contingencies interact to reinforce problem behavior, the synthesized analysis really, again, it doesn't answer that question and offers no analysis. But if your question is, does one or more of the combined reinforcement contingencies reinforce problem behavior, then a ISCA or a synthesized analysis does offer an analysis, and it answers that question. And in fact, I would say that's one of the positive things about it, is it answers that question very, very quickly. And so I could see a potential for doing a synthesized analysis as a screen to see if you're likely to find problem behavior when you manipulate contingencies. And I think it does that fairly well. However, that was my initial thinking that might be a reasonable thing to do. But we've recently have a study that we're just about to write up. We've completed, just about to write it up. And what we did in this study was to do an analog of a functional analysis. And the first thing we did was to train a function of problem behavior. And we used an analog of problem behavior where we had the child hit a pad that was on the table. And we trained the child to hit a pad to either, for some children, we taught them to hit a pad to get attention. Other children, we taught to hit a pad to get access to a tangible item, say an iPad. And then other children, we taught them to hit a pad to get to access escape or a break from non-preferred tasks. So going into our functional analyses, we actually knew what the function of problem behavior was because we trained it with each individual participant. So the next thing we did was to do a standard traditional functional analysis using the procedures described by Iwata. And in every case, the functional analysis identified the function that we'd trained prior to starting the functional analysis.
Was this done by evaluators who are blind to the training process?
I don't think so, but I could double check on whether we did. I don't think we it'd be very difficult to do that in our environment with real good control of they would actually be blind, because it's a fairly open environment.
Got it.
But that's a good question. So then we did a synthesized analysis where we combined all three contingencies, attention, escape, and tangible, because that's the most common form of synthesized analysis. I think it accounts for about 60% of the published cases of synthesized functional analyses. And then and we got the typical results. That is, that the test condition rapidly produced high rates of behavior, and the control condition produced very low rates of problem behavior. And then we went back and repeated the traditional FA. And what we found is in roughly, I think it was 2 out of 5 of the 5 cases, we found that by synthesizing the contingencies, we actually induced a new function of problem behavior, one that we had not taught originally. So for example, we had one child who I think had an attention function that we taught. The first standard functional analysis identified that attention function and no other function. We then did the synthesized analysis and then repeated the standard functional analysis. And then that repetition of the standardized functional analysis, we then had a child who had both an attention function that we taught and a new function in terms of escape from non-preferred demands. And we had another participant that developed a tangible function when we hadn't taught that originally. And so one of the potential side effects and risks of a synthesized analysis is that it exposes the individual to a very powerful contingency. That is, each time the problem behavior occurs, the functional reinforcer is delivered along with other potential reinforcers. And so you have the possibility of a new function developing where that new function might not have developed in the natural environment, because it's not often that would contact an NFR1 schedule in the natural environment. And so we see this as problematic from the standpoint of potential negative side effects of the synthesized contingency. And we have one more study that is also very completed, and we're analyzing the data and preparing it for publication, in which we tested out the hypothesis that the interview actually informs the functional analysis. And so what we did in that study was to use the interview formats developed by Hanley et al. And went through the informed FA synthesized analysis, and then did other ones where we just did a uninformed, I guess you'd call it, where we combined attention, tangible, and escape all into a synthesized contingency, and basically compared those again with a traditional FA. And the results are not completely clean, but basically we saw little evidence that having the interview as a way to inform the essay produced differential results. That is, we got very similar results whether we combined all of the contingencies without basing it on an interview, or whether we based what went into the synthesized contingency based on the results of an interview. So I guess that's my long answer. My short answer is
Dr. Fisher. Long answers are a-okay on the podcast, so keep it up.
Yeah. So my short answer is that we've tried to identify what the synthesized analysis does and doesn't do, and what it does do is produce differential responding between the test and control condition very consistently and very rapidly. But it also does not identify when there is or is not interaction effects. And it has the potential to create functions when functions hadn't existed prior to the synthesized analysis. And at least from what we've seen, the information provided by the interview doesn't really result in different results.
So what is your take on, I guess, the treatment effects that Greg and some of the folks from his lab who have moved on to other settings are getting? For example, I just saw a paper by Joshua Jessel and others, and I think they did like 25 or 30 replications of the ISCA and the treatment and things like that. Um, and I looked at the paper very briefly, but my impression was that they were getting good results. So, I mean, do you think there's an alternative explanation as to the outcomes that they're generating?
I think, yeah, I think as I said at the outset, I think the treatment is a good one. I think combining reinforcers to reinforce appropriate behavior is a good thing. But combining them to reinforce problem behavior when you don't know that those combined reinforcers function as reinforcement in the natural environment is potentially dangerous. And so they get really good results because if you say, okay, I don't even know what the function of problem behavior is, but I've got a good idea that it is either attention, tangible items, or escape in, a majority of cases. And now I'm just going to deliver those contingent on appropriate communication response. That has a high probability that that's going to be effective without really understanding the function of problem behavior.
I see.
So again, I have no problem with combining reinforcers to reduce problem behavior and reinforce alternative behavior. But I do have a problem with adding contingencies to problem behavior in a functional analysis because it doesn't determine the function of problem behavior with any degree of specificity or accuracy, and it has the potential to actually create a function where one didn't exist before.
Okay, cool. I appreciate your perspective on that. Celia's last question is: any chance of a debate with Greg on the Behavioral Observations podcast? Celia, thank you for asking that. You don't. Well, I don't want to put you on the spot. We'll go on to another question here. Let's see. Bob asked a question. It's kind of a interesting social validity question, I think. In many job articles on self-injury I've seen rate per minute graphs on the y-axis of 0 to 3, for example, and a point plotted at 0.1 makes it look like the behavior's been effectively treated. Yet that is a rate of 1 of every 10 minutes, 6 per hour, 96 per day, etc. So I guess the general question is, what does treatment success look like? If a behavior is reduced, but it's still reduced but it's not completely, I don't want to say eradicated, but it's still occurring at a rate, depending in this example, if it's a very intensive self-injurious response that could be very meaningful. So just from a data analysis standpoint, and again, a social validity standpoint, what are some indicators that you have a successful intervention?
Well, I think you just answered the question. Is you look at it from a data perspective, and typically we set the criteria as a 85-90% reduction in problem behavior. However, if it's still occurring at troublesome rates, or it's occurring very infrequently, but it's very, very dangerous, then you haven't met the criteria of it's socially acceptable. We have a socially valid and acceptable treatment for our consumers. And so we really need to do both of those things. We need to make sure that we've reduced the behavior markedly, and our customers are satisfied and happy with where things are at. So, my big example of what your question implies is that pica can be very, very dangerous with somebody who's swallowing inedible objects that may be poisonous or that may be dangerous and can cause blockages, internal blockages, etc. My belief is that if at all possible, whenever possible, we need to reduce that to 0 or very close to 0 levels. That's not possible with everybody, but you have to both, look at what the data say, and then how is it from just a quality standpoint and social acceptability standpoint, have you made the individual safe, and have you made your customers happy? And there's no, I don't think there's a clear criterion for that, but both of those things need to be examined when you're, so sometimes you have somebody that you've done everything you can, and they have, you know, we've had kids where we've reduced their behavior by 95%, and then they still have episodes, infrequent but very, very dangerous episodes, and so that's not successful. In some cases, what remains may not be operant behavior, and then we try to work with the psychiatrist or developmental pediatrician to see whether or not there's something else that might be done, say with medication. And sometimes once we've treated the operant component of someone's behavior, what's left, it may be easier to diagnose, you know, here's something that might be amenable to treatment with medication. And so we need to, you know, in general, we need to look at both the data. We've reduced it as much as we possibly can. And is it possible that something else other than behavior analysis may be appropriate for what remains?
All right. I want to wrap up here in a little bit. I want to wrap up with some kind of, I guess, practice level questions in terms of our field. So it's a two-part question. First of all, do you have any concerns for our field? You know, one of the things that's said a lot is that our field is kind of in its infancy, and it's obviously going through a rapid expansion phase right now. So do you have any concerns about where behavior analysis is or where it's going? And then conversely, are there developments in the field that that you're excited about and looking forward to seeing where things head?
Okay. So what I'm worried about, I would say there are three primary things. One is the field is rapidly expanding, as you said, and that's by and large a good thing. But what I worry about with that is that we need to deliver on quality control. And so when we train people, we need to train them to mastery performance as behavior analysts, and we need to give them good supervised experience so that when we turn them loose and have them start working with kids and families, that they're going to do a good job and it's going to reflect well in our field. And so quality control, I think, is a major issue as we continue to grow at a fairly rapid rate. A second thing that I worry about is also related to growth, and that has to do with our costs. So as we treat more and more kids, the cost of behavior analysis becomes more and more noticeable. And so if we ever get to a point where we're treating all the kids on the autism spectrum with the levels of service that they need, it's going to be a huge amount of money. And that will probably result in reactions from politicians, insurance companies, etc. And what we should be doing is figuring out how to be more efficient and do behavior analysis well with less resources before somebody imposes resources and we don't have that technology down to be both efficient and effective. And I think that's an important area of research that we really need to focus on. And then the third thing, also growth related, is that we're now seeing investment capitalists come into the field, corporations buying up behavior analysis companies, some of the more larger ones, but and so I'm concerned about we try to make money at what we do, we try to pay our folks a reasonable wage, but corporations are going to come in with a profit motivation that will, perhaps negatively impact the quality of services. And so I worry about, as that happens, will the effectiveness of ABA services suffer based on a profit motivation? I don't know for sure that that's going to happen, but it's something I worry about.
Mm-hmm. And any the last question would be, and I close this, pretty much every interview with this question. I always find that the answers are surprising, but do you have any advice for a newly minted BCBA? Someone just went through all the coursework, all the supervision, they studied their butts off and passed the exam. They're in their first job right now. What advice do you have to that practitioner?
Yeah, there's a saying that we have here about something we call bucket awareness. At some point in our life, we all experience going around as if we had a bucket on our head. And because when you're a new BCBA, you start getting referrals and kids and things that maybe weren't covered in your classes and weren't discussed in sufficient detail, and you feel like you're going around with a bucket on your head and bumping into things and not knowing exactly how to proceed. And what I would recommend is that you approach that with what we call bucket awareness, that you realize and be willing to admit that you're walking around with a bucket on your head and bumping into things. And when you don't know something, that you seek appropriate help and supervision, and don't come away thinking, I have the certificate now, I can do anything. All of us have our limitations, including myself. I consider myself a student of behavior analysis, and I learn things every day. And I think when you're new to the field and you have that you have your degree and you have your certificate, there is some social expectation that you have to be able to solve problems and everything that comes at you immediately. And I recommend that people recognize that they can't always do that, and that they seek out help when they need it.
Great. Well, fantastic thoughts to end on. Dr. Fisher, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Okay, folks, thanks for joining me today in episode 45. I will see you again next time, hopefully with a not so grating voice. I kind of feel like I sound like one of Marge Simpson's sisters. And again, next time it'll be better. So I look forward to seeing you in episode 46. Huge thanks to Chartlytics and Operant Coffee for sponsoring the program. And I'll see you later.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.